Welcome to this special bonus chapter of the Still Drivin Man, John Henry, the Untold Story of an American Legend audiobook. I'm Panama Jackson, narrator of the audiobook and columnist and culture commentator. The novel recounts the true story of the man behind the iconic American hero, John Henry, the mighty railroad man who could blast through rock faster than a steam drill. The term John Henryism was coined by Dr. Sherman A. James, who introduced the concept in his research paper titled John Henryism and Blood Pressure Differences Among Black Men. The term describes a coping style used by African Americans inspired by the legendary figure, John Henry. It involves putting in tremendous effort to face stress and challenges, especially when dealing with systemic oppression. It has been linked to various health outcomes in Black communities. Simply put, it's like having a superhero mindset all the time, pushing through barriers, never backing down, even in the face of stress and adversity. And I think all of us in the Black community know exactly what that means. Today, we're going to delve into that coping style. We'll be exploring the cultural relevance of John Henryism within Black communities, particularly as they navigate systemic oppression and racism. We'll dive deep into more of what this high-effort coping style is and how it influences both the mental and physical health outcomes of individuals in diverse Black populations. What's going on, everybody? My name is Panama Jackson. I am a columnist in the Grio and a person who writes and spends a lot of time dealing with Black cultural interests, specifically race, pop culture, general Blackness, hip hop, music. I'm one of those all-purpose kind of individuals. And that's kind of sort of how we got to where we are today, where I had the opportunity to narrate a book called Still Drivin Man, John Henry, the Untold Story of an American Legend, written by Scott Reynolds Nelson, which is, as the title suggests, an academic but like narrative nonfiction discussion about John Henry, who is a myth and legend kind of in, I guess, in cultural circles. I think in the Black community in particular, he holds a different significance. But as a part of like American folklore, John Henry is a legend who is a part of the way that we view the man versus the machine, and kind of can be used to make all type of inferences about, labor and just anything. As it turns out, in this panel that we're doing, will illustrate that. There are really a ton of intersections you can make about John Henry and what he means culturally. But out of the discussion about John Henry and reading the book is this term, John Henryism, which is my understanding a sort of, I read the term strategy for coping, but it almost seems like strategy is the absolute wrong term. It seems like the worst thing you can possibly do to some degree. And I think the Black community in particular, we have a certain relationship to this idea of John Henryism. In order to have this conversation, we've gathered three individuals who have a wealth of knowledge about different facets of the John Henryism conversation. We are joined by Dr. Millicent Robinson, who is a renowned interdisciplinary scholar, consultant, and certified Reiki therapy practitioner. Her research centers on stress, coping, health, and healing experiences of Black women. And her work to date has illuminated the ways that John Henryism shapes both mental and physical health among Black Americans, with a particular focus on women and ethnic subgroups of Black Americans. So I'm very excited to talk about that in particular. We're also joined by Dr. Benjamin Torsney, who is an experienced educator and researcher specializing in educational psychology. His work delves into the coping strategies of urban college students, particularly the impact of John Henryism on their engagement in schoolwork. So we got education here. And we are joined also by Dr. Jas Sullivan, who is a distinguished scholar in African-American politics and voting behavior. His research expertise centers on understanding how race and racial identity impact electoral decision-making. Always an important conversation, especially around electoral season. And through his work, Dr. Sullivan has explored various aspects of John Henryism, including its connections to political decision-making and policy compliance during the COVID-19 pandemic. The intersections of the things that you all talk about are quite fascinating. So for one, thank you all for being here. How are you all doing?
I'm doing well. Hope you're doing well. Hope y'all are doing well.
Yeah.
So far, so good. Just finished teaching.
Thank you,
Looking
Pam.
forward to this conversation.
Yeah. let me just say, as when I did the narration for the book, so obviously I didn't write the book, but I did the narration. But in order to narrate a book, you have to read a book and understand. And I learned a lot more about John Henry just as a human, the real story, so to speak, but also understanding the folklore end of it. I had never heard the term John Henryism, right? I'd never heard that term before, but it also seems obvious when understanding the story of John Henry. But for those people who've never heard it like I was, let's start with you, Dr. Robinson. Let's kind of set the table here. What exactly is John Henryism? And, Dr. Torsney, Dr. Sullivan, once she's finished, feel free to jump in if you have something to add on to it. But what is John Henryism in simple terms?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, Panama. And so the the specific definition is that John Henryism is a form of high effort active coping with psychosocial and environmental stressors. And essentially, I like to break this down into essentially pushing yourself past your limits. That's how I like to explain John Henryism to folks. And so, particularly just thinking about when you are dealing with different types of stressors or chronic stressors or different challenges, when we experience these types of stressors, we try to draw upon coping mechanisms to adapt healthfully so that that stress does not harm our health. And so I like to think of John Henryism as a form of culturally relevant coping specifically, because it has a particular significance for Black Americans. And so for someone who is engaging in high John Henryism, they're more likely to push themselves, hard work and determination, in those types of ideologies when they are faced with stressors. Whereas with someone who engages in low John Henryism, they're less likely to engage in those types of behaviors when they are experiencing when they're encountering stressful experiences.
And let me add to that. I think Melissa did a really good job, and the connection to John Henry is very important as well, because what Sherman James found was that through the Jackson Hart studies, that you can be a high effort coper, but that doesn't prevent you from having all of the negative health consequences. And so this is where he saw a pattern and really coined the term John Henryism, because the myth of the man was that he beat a machine,
Right.
beat the machine, beat the society, and died, right? And so he saw, Sherman James saw the same pattern played out in real everyday life. Those who achieved great amount of success were high effort copers oftentimes, but they also had all the negative health effects that comes with it. And so I just wanted to connect the high effort coping part to also the negative effects that come with it.
Just to add to that, I think at least what I've read from John Henryism and kind of what other people have conceptualized it as kind of a trait. And I think it's important to kind of explain coping as a state or a response to a context. So I think that's something that I try to talk about in my work. It's like, I mean, Dr. Robinson, you did a great job with the definition, but thinking about it as this kind of state that just, if it doesn't get turned off, if the context doesn't support it, then that's when you start to run into these problems. And I'll also add that I think there's this paradoxical nature to it that I think we'll probably get into in a little bit. That's really important, and I think really interesting when we start to think about things like John Henryism and kind of move away from concepts like grit or resilience and things that I think can be more damaging.
Yeah, it's interesting that you went there, because I was kind of walk into the paradoxical idea that as a layman, this just sounds like being Black. So, for instance, we love a good struggle quote in the Black community. No struggle, no progress. I mean, Frederick Douglass was spitting that game back in the 1800s, right? We love, I don't look like what I've been through. It's like this idea of pushing through, and it's not quite resilience or grit. It's just the nature of being in the Black community. Kind of sounds like it's called John Henryism, but it really just sounds like being Black to me. I hate to say that, but it really just kind of sounds like how we the narrative around Blackness tends to be one that's rooted in struggle, and I hate that for us, because I mean that comes with where we're going to go next, like the health impacts of this, right? Like that means we live shorter lives because we're stressed to high hell at all times, and we lean into it, seemingly leaning to it anyway, in ways that, and look, I'm a Black Southerner, right? So I come from a long line of Black Southern folks where going to the doctor and seeing folks ain't really how we do business. We really just kind of like pray it out. We hope it's gonna get better. And I think COVID was a very fine demonstrator of how that doesn't work. So kind of let's dig a little bit into, like, what are the health issues and concerns about, John Henryism. And again, I'm going to try not to just view this as like a Black condition thing, but it really just sounds like growing up Black in America to me. So, Dr. Robinson, I think you deal specifically with the healing and the physical and mental health parts. Let's start with you again, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Panama, for sharing that. And I want to affirm what you are sharing in terms of the Black experience. And so, reading Dr. Sherman James' earlier works, particularly has a 1994 paper on John Henryism and Black American health, essentially. And really, when I think about John Henryism, I explain it to folks in terms of it's really a response, or it really reflects the societal and cultural and historical landscapes that really shapes the lived experience of Black folks as we're navigating systems of racism, capitalism, and other forms of systemic oppression. And so when you say that's what it feels like, that in so many ways is what it is. And so in terms of the physical health impacts, and so I've looked at physical and mental health outcomes, but particularly in terms of physical health, it really hypertension, cardiovascular disease, because essentially you're pushing yourself past your limit. And in terms of thinking about the connection between one's mind and their body, in so many ways, I think that engaging in John Henryism essentially severs that mind body connection. And so what happens is you're pushing yourself, and pushing yourself, and you feel good mentally because you're addressing these stresses that you're facing. But over time, it's wearing and tearing on you internally. And so this idea we don't look like what we've been through, maybe on the outside, but what does it look like in terms of on the inside physiologically? So things like cardiovascular disease, higher rates of hypertension, even higher internal wear and tear or allostatic load is something that you will hear. And so it's really challenging. And most research has focused on the physical implications of it. And, engaging in John Henryism maybe temporarily is okay, but long term, it's not a long term solution when these societal conditions are not changing in a significant way. And so what you have is, for example, in some scholarship I've done, one of the first papers I did on John Henryism, I looked at how it shaped mental and physical health among Black men and Black women, because a part of the conversation I want to bring in here is that Black men and Black women actually engage in John Henryism at similar rates. And so that is something that is interesting, particularly in terms of the gendered component of this concept of John Henryism, but it does different things to their health. And so in this particular paper, I actually found that, John Henryism is protective for depressive symptoms, which is mental health. So the higher levels of John Henryism you engage in, the fewer depressive symptoms you feel. But in terms of internal wear and tear on the body, it harms your internal wear and tear. And so John Henryism was actually associated with higher allostatic load. And what happens is when you have higher allostatic load, that means you're at higher risk for developing other chronic health conditions in the future. And so when you think about John Henryism and Black Americans, it's a contentious challenge to navigate. It's like, how do we navigate these systems and respond to these systems while it's actively harming us? Like, how do we hold that duality in the reality of the situation?
In Panama, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a nearly 400-year struggle right? There are negative experiences coming in people's directions all of the time, and they have to navigate in real time what are they going to do. And sometimes I wonder, is it even a conscious process? I don't even think it's a conscious process. Is it a subconscious
That's why I said it's
process,
like being
right?
black in
So when you
America.
say,
You just
yeah,
do it. It's
yeah,
just innate to kind of
you
how
just
you
do it.
raise and how people interact with you growing up. We just, and I don't mean to cut you off and I apologize. We just kind of unintentionally give this constant struggle to the continuing generations because that's what we know. And I'm not saying that all the black experience is negative, but all the isms that Dr. Robinson referred to, that's not even us. That none of that stuff is something that we brought or built. It's something that we have to contend with that disproportionately impacts us downward. I'm sorry, please continue.
No. But I think you're right. And I think the question each individual has to ask is, how are they going to cope, right, with these stressors, right? And I don't even think, I think oftentimes is not a conscious process. It's a subconscious process, whether you experience this so frequently. The question is, are you going to overcome? What are those decisions that you're going to make in order to achieve success, right? And sometimes I don't even think we ourselves as educated people even consciously or subconsciously make those decisions. So I just wanted to add that component, but it's nearly a 400-year history of racism and discrimination, and in all areas of life. And people have to make those decisions, and it has real health consequences, economic consequences, political consequences. These are decisions that people have to make every day.
And I'll add to that. Clearly, I'm not black, so I can't speak about the black experience, but I can say I'm from West Virginia. So we learned about John Henry very early on. And I think for me, and kind of watching and observing my friends of color, specifically my black friends, there was always this narrative about resilience, right? Always resilient. This person is resilient. This person is resilient. In West Virginia, where I grew up, is a horribly racist place. Horribly. Right, being white affords me anonymity there, so right, I could choose whether or not I wanted to be privy to this or not. But something always kind of sat wrong with me. Didn't sit right with me when I was like, okay, this person is resilient. When I saw, if they're resilient, that means you could shovel more. I don't know. I think you can edit this more shit onto them. And as that was happening, and as my friends grew, as they developed, they got sicker. So I didn't have the words for this John Henryism thing until recently. I've always just kind of had these default resilience kind of narratives or words to describe, which to me seems like a label. And what worries me is that when we start labeling people, we then blame the person, not the system. And I think for me in my research, what I'm thinking about is John Henryism does a really good job of saying, hey, the system's really messed up. This is an active response to the system. Let's change the system, as opposed to being like, you're this, take more. Right. So it's those kind of things where I've been kind of trying to figure out what it looks like, me as an observer, not as somebody who has actually had that put on me.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to jump into some of that, like actionably, like what the manifestation of it is in real world terms. Like I can understand it, especially the way you explained it, Dr. Robinson. I understand, like, it still seems somewhat abstract, because again, for me, it's like culturally, I view this as just really, or it sounds to me very much like because of society, this is a culture that has become, the way that we operate culturally seems to be embedded in it. But that also then means it manifests in different ways in all different factors of life, right? So, Dr. Torsney, you work in the education field, and Dr. Sullivan, you've done this work with voting and all of these things. And how, I guess, so I kind of want to talk about the education end of this, because I think it's
Sure.
fascinating, like, and please correct me if I'm wrong when I'm saying these things. If I'm missing the point on what it means, I'm trying to understand it from like my engagement with it. But like, you know, we always have that, you work twice as hard to get half as far thing in the Black community. Every Black person has heard that, especially those of us considered high achieving and making. We always have this thing where you're fighting the good fight to get somewhere. You gotta like, you have to be an overachiever. You have to succeed beyond what is expected of you in order just to be seen, in order to be viewed as comparable or whatever. And I kind of wonder how, that plays out educationally, right? I went to an HBCU. I went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. And interestingly, I moved from Atlanta to Washington, D.C., where I got a master's degree at the University of Maryland, which oddly seems like an HBCU because of the amount of Black people on Maryland's campus. I was really surprised by the high numbers of Black people there. But that also impacts the way that I do business and the way that I get my education because I feel comfortable and supported, right? But let's say you're in a space where you aren't. Dr. Torsney, you're talking about being from West Virginia. I would imagine. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, like I remember Bluefield State was an HBCU that is largely white now, right? Like you get these spaces that
It's
right there you
predominantly
go,
white
right? It's
HBCU.
an HBCU that it started out as it's still an HBCU historically in name only, though, right? Like at this point, so I kind of wonder how this plays out. The idea of John Henryism plays out for black students or students of color, however we want to define that, in terms of what that looks like on campus and how that impacts outcomes down the line. If that's an appropriate question in terms of how John Henryism impacts, the bigger picture.
Yeah. So I think a few things. So thinking about John Henryism and thinking about it as a way to kind of conceptualize it better. There's a professor at Georgia named Gene Brody who calls it skin deep resilience that aligns pretty well with John Henryism. So I tell people, like, what's John Henryism? It's like skin deep resilience. So like what you might observe kind of in the front might not actually be like what you might observe might actually not be happening under the skin. So that's kind of one way that I think about it. So I'm in an interesting place. I'm at Temple University, and Temple University is highly diverse, right? So there's a lot of different people, and I'm not talking just racially diverse. I'm talking socioeconomically, first gen status, those kinds of things. I do think the biggest issue when it comes to education specifically is design. Right, I think that a lot of this is a design issue. I mean, when we think about racism, systemic racism, period, it is a designed thing. But those, like, our spaces, our educational spaces, I don't think are neutral. Right, I think they have cultural value, they have attitudes, they have beliefs within those things. So one of my goals, and I'm a psychologist, right? So I think about psychological safety. How do my students come into my classroom and engage with me, with each other, and with the schoolwork? So when I say it's a design issue, the content that I teach needs to be designed specifically that everybody can engage to the extent that they want to. And then also I think about it in terms of who's in the class, what's the makeup of the class, how are other people engaging with each other, right? This is like, I'm very intentional about how I design courses. So for one, you said you're a hip hop fan. I teach a course on the psychology of hip hop. So teaching a course on the psychology of hip hop, one, we talk about John Henry is in there. And then we talk about kind of what hustle culture and those kinds of things mean. But it gives a space for people to be comfortable to talk about their experiences through the lens of this, through the lens of this like culture and music. So there's a very intentional design on my part to give space to everybody to come and be able to engage to the extent that they want to. I don't think traditional schooling, especially when it comes to instruction, here are my slides, here's what I need you to get from it, here's the test, is all that equitable. I don't think it is. And I think these are really serious design issues, from the content that we give to even like coming into the spaces. Like, what does it say when we line people up in rows and have them just, bring in information? So are there interventions? Not that I've seen, but I do think that we need to be really specific about how we incorporate and have students engage in class, because if it's places where people don't feel safe, you might be able to see that John Henryism kind of start to bubble up. Or if you don't see John Henryism in the act of coping, then you just get disengagement, and that's not what you want from students by any stretch of the imagination.
when I think of, especially in the last few years, right? We've seen the HBCU application rates skyrocket, especially in the wake of George Floyd. You know, like the whole idea of safety and mental health or self care. Let's go the self care route, which I would think would have some type of impact on the idea of John Henryism in terms of perhaps not doing the thing that I don't want to use the proper term, as would reduce high John Henryism, I suppose. If you're in a space where you feel supported and more supported and, I guess, seen, maybe you
Sure.
aren't so concerned with trying to be the exception. Like, and again, I keep using these terms. Like, I think like Black exceptionalism is rooted in that as well, right? Like, let's be the best. And I could be wrong, but that's how I hear these things. So I wonder if, from you all's work in psychology and these things, do you see, and I guess it's maybe too early to tell, like, because of these shifts that you see where black students in particular are definitely trying to get into these Black spaces more, where they probably feel that they're going to be more supported and seen and have more resources that are geared towards who we are as people. Like, does that should that impact positively, like the idea, not the idea, but the coping, the stress that comes with being Black in America? I guess, should that on its face be some type of system correction? Maybe. That's an awkward question. I understand. Like, I realize I'm asking an awkward question, but I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, if being in spaces educationally, it seems like being Black in white spaces is a detriment to your mental. Like, I will say that I feel like sometimes being in those spaces can be a detriment. If it's somebody who doesn't have a picture of Frank Ocean's Blonde album on their wall, you're going to be the kind of person that might actually view the students differently than somebody who does not, right? And some people, when you go into classrooms, I was in grad school and I was in a space where I was one of few Black students. And I did feel at times like, you don't even understand me. You don't see where I'm going. So now, like, culturally, I'm forced to try to fit into your space as opposed to you seeing my worldview. But if you're going to spaces that fit your worldview in space, I would imagine that would be a positive, at least in terms of, if John Henryism is a thing that could potentially kill you because of what it causes for you health-wise, if you're in spaces where you are more seen or feel more supported in spaces that are safer, it should have a positive impact, right?
It's funny teaching this hip hop class, actually, right? Specifically thinking about me as a white man teaching this hip hop class to a lot of non-white students. What I've been seeing, though, which I find very interesting, especially over the past few semesters, is that a lot of my white students tend to kind of become reserved, and they don't want to speak, and they don't want to be called or even thought about potentially being called racist. And so I get the conversations dominated by my students of color. And that right there tells me that, one, they're engaged to a certain extent, and two, some of what we're saying, because I don't lecture at them often, is culturally relevant. So I think one of the things that happens is that designing the spaces to be culturally relevant, and I think hip hop specifically is an easy entryway into that. Right? It's like the people, they listen to it, they follow it, so on and so forth. But it's an easy entryway into that. And I think having these culturally relevant spaces, specifically when you start getting out of sociology, psychology, anthropology, Africology, right? Like you start getting into these spaces that aren't as culturally relevant, are quote unquote objective. And I think when you start getting there, that's when you start to see kind of higher levels of John Henryism pop up, because you're like, how does my identity, is there dissonance with my identity in this space or not? So I really do. I think this is very much a design issue, specifically in higher education, about how we get students and how we design courses that are culturally relevant, because I think that's critical. And I think if you do that, then you will start to hear different voices, which also might happen where you start to get different voices recede into the background, which is a really interesting kind of phenomena that happens.
Yeah. Dr. Sullivan, how does this play out in voting? Like how does this play out in your space where, let's be real, the conversations, especially about voting patterns of different groups. I mean, black men's voting patterns are always, at this point, we're always on the hot seat now, right? We're always, apparently, this recent polling coming out. One of my colleagues at the outlet that I work at just decided to light the world on fire, talking about why black men are all voting for Trump and things like that. But like, what do you see in your work about the intersection of John Henryism and like civic engagement and activism and political activism and all that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And I think I'll start with why I actually looked at this concept in politics. There's really nothing about coping on political behavior and beliefs. And so I'm thinking, if there are stressors, and we know that John Henryism affects health behaviors, why wouldn't coping affect political behaviors and political choices and beliefs? Because we know that political racism exists, right? How many states have to now go back and redraw their districts, right? North Carolina, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, all have to go back and redraw their districts. To me, this is political racism, right? And so black voters have to decide, do they want to vote? These are stressors in the political sphere, I call it. These are stressors that people have to make real life choices. It's not just redrawing districts. Right. It's also about voting, voting laws that stifle access to the ballot. So these are what I call political racism that minorities, African Americans have to really navigate and think through whether they want to be a political participant. And so my thought was that how does John Henryism, who is going to actively participate? Are those high effort copers more likely to have certain types of political beliefs? Are they more likely to go vote? Are they more likely to participate in politics? And so that's when I began to apply this concept to political behavior and beliefs. And so what we found was that in terms of policies, high effort copers were more likely to support race-specific policies. So they were more likely to support majority-minority districts. They're more likely to support policies that target African Americans. They were more likely to support reparations than low effort copers. In addition, what we found was that in terms of ideological beliefs, high effort copers were more likely to support Black nationalism. High effort copers were more likely to have American national pride. And they were more likely to support this concept of work ethic. All you have to do is work hard in order to be successful. And so what we found were patterns about ideological beliefs and policy beliefs that high effort copers were more likely to support policies that support African Americans. But what we also found was the opposite effect. So when we looked at actual political participation, we found no significance. So we found that high effort copers were not more or less likely to vote. Were not more or less likely to participate in other types of politics, contribute to campaigns, or we also did a study that looked at protest participation. High effort copers were less likely to participate in protests. And so we had to really think through why we found this, right? And what we found was that what we argued, because this hasn't been done in politics, what we argued was high effort copers engaged in behaviors that helped the individual seek success. If it required collective effort, they were less likely to engage. So it makes perfect sense on voting and protest. So that if it required a collective effort in order to get success, they were less likely to engage in it. But if they were more likely to engage in or believe in policies and engage in behaviors that they had their own self-determination, that didn't require collective effort. It was through my effort, I'm going to find success. But if it required me, my neighbors, and millions of other people, they were less likely to engage in that type of behavior.
So it's interesting because it sounds a lot like, I'm going to use an example because this is what I hear. It sounds kind of like Booker T. Washington would be high coping, right? He would be a Malcolm X. These are high coping individuals that, I'm using pop culture figures that are highly recognizable, but, support. But so everything that you said first about the policies that they would support, I'm like, oh, that's Malcolm right there all day long, right? Like, this is all the thing. But you talk about not voting. Yeah, well, there's Malcolm too, because it's like this system doesn't apply to me, the black man. So why would I engage in these things that don't really make my life better? Don't really. So it's funny because really what it sounds like is people who have the ability to withstand the blowback are the people who have are more like that's what it sounds like. The people to me who feel like they're willing to take the stand against the system and deal with what might come back, or the high effort copers, as you say. And that seems like an activist space, like people who are high on an activism and willing to jump out there on a limb. Like you see a lot of that in the wake of George Floyd and all of that, like after Black Lives Matter, after that became the thing that the nation kind of wrestled with. So it's interesting because I just kept thinking of civil rights activists as you're speaking. And as a on a personal level, like I do think about sometimes where my family's in Alabama, and there's a lot of that where all the political racism is rampant and excited and antagonistic, like very publicly antagonistic. And there is a lot of that. Well, we just got to keep hoping one day it's going to work, right? One day things are going to get better. But I'm thinking about that even on that scale. Like, is the fight worth fighting? Seems almost like that would have some determination on where you fall on that scale, right? Because if you're in a state where your vote doesn't, or you view your vote as not mattering, sometimes it's just a symbolic victory that we still have the ability to do that. Everybody died for my right to do this. I'm going to do this, whether or not it has any real impact or not. But that's quite fascinating. Like what is the response to studies about that of that type of work?
Yeah, I mean, first let me just say that this was an older data set.
Okay.
So this data set wasn't during the Obama era. This was before that election.
Okay.
But we are in the midst of collecting data for this election. But when we wrote that in our book, we were surprised because we really thought high active copers would be the first people out there voting and contributing and politically engaged. But then we did another study, and in the wake of George Floyd and all the police brutality and killings, we asked respondents, 900 or so African Americans, about whether they engaged in protest participation. And we wanted to see how did John Henryism affect who was more likely to participate in protest. And again, our results came back as high effort copers were less likely to engage in protest participation. And again, because there's not a lot written on this, our argument was, as we theorize about this, is that maybe, for those who are, again, high effort copers, they may be individualistic. They may be pragmatic. They may be those individuals who say, I can control what I can control and for what I can do. But if it relies on other people, maybe that's not something I want to engage in, right? So that's where we're trying to figure out and do more work in, is to look at more recent data, but also to continue to theorize about this argument that are high effort copers more individualistic versus having a collective mentality, right? And I think about sometimes like in education, you brought up education, right? I think high effort copers, and we're going to need more work on this, is that high effort copers, I think, work to achieve, even in education spaces, what they can do. What are their goals? What are their aspirations? What are things that they can control, and leave out engagement in other things that require other people's intervention, right? And that's what
Sure.
that's what we really need to focus on. Is it individualistic or collective mentality?
And Dr. Sullivan, I think you'll appreciate this. So I have a paper in review that looks at sense of belonging as a predictor of John Henryism. And in the paper, it says that feeling a high sense of belonging actually leads to higher levels of effortful active coping. So there is that thing. And I think one of the kind of paradoxical, and it's probably not paradoxical, but one of the things that I think underpins John Henryism that Dr. James has written about is, yes, there is this kind of like pragmatic or individualistic aspect, but there's also this sense of support that's needed to support the John Henryism. And I think he wrote about it when he was talking about when he kind of wrote his narrative of John Henry Martin, where the story of John Henry comes from. And he talks about it like John Henry Martin being steeped in the church and having support from his family and having support from his community as a way of overcoming that. So I see from at least from what I've read in the research, it's like, yes, it is an individualistic thing or an individualistic phenomenon. I mean, even on the John Henryism scale, it's like sometimes I feel that if anything's going to be done right, I have to do it myself. But there's also this sense of support that's kind of, or sense of belonging that's kind of underpinning one's ability to do it, which I think is kind of a really nice, interesting nuance to how we think about John Henryism.
Yeah, and I would add, I don't know if it's a good or bad thing to be individualistic or collectivist. So I'm not
Sure.
going to make that argument. But what I would say is that maybe for those who are high effort copers who don't engage in collective action, maybe their thought process is, I'm going to do what I can to change the system, right? So it's not to say that they're not concerned with the issues that are going on. The question always becomes agency. What is my role? What part am I going to take in changing the system? And for some people, and for what we found, from the data, is that for those who are more individualistic, if high effort copers are individualistic, maybe their thought process is, I can control what I do. I'm going to try to achieve that in order to change the structure, to change the condition. And I think we have to have both types of individuals, right? Those who say, okay, let's collectively go and do something, but also those who say, I know what I can do. I'm going to strive to do that in the midst of all the stressors that I'm going to face. And I'm going to change the system. And I think, and I want to add this, Panama, I think this is good question that you asked also, is that, we also did another study and we looked at reactions to discrimination, right? So in experiencing discrimination, we asked 3 questions. Are you more likely to pray about it? Who's more likely to pray about it? Are you more likely to work harder to prove others wrong? And would you try to do something about it? in all of those three questions of reactions to discrimination, it was high effort copers who were more likely to pray about it, prove others wrong, and try to do something about it, right? So, in that way, they're individualistic in that they are going to speak up. They're more likely to speak up about about how they experience discrimination and proving others wrong, and so forth. So high effort copers are in many ways not passive, but they speak up when it is relying on their condition individually. What are their experiences?
And I wanted to add on to that, Dr. Sullivan, in terms of thinking about coping. And so we have emotion focused coping and we have problem focused coping. And so, what your research, well, essentially, John Henryism is categorized as one of those problem focused forms of coping. And so, I think thinking about it from that particular perspective, it lends support like for your findings in terms of those who felt like they could do something about whatever issue it was. They were the ones that were going to be more likely to engage in high John Henryism, because it's like, okay, I have this problem, I have this stressor in front of me, this challenge. If I don't feel like I can do anything about it, I'm going to be a lot less likely to engage in that high effort coping, because I don't feel like psychologically, I don't feel like my effort is going to shift the situation in any way, shape, or form. Whereas is, if you do feel that way, you are going to be more likely to like push and push. And something that hasn't been talked about in the conversation, which I think is really important to think about in terms of John Henryism, in terms of John Henryism itself, is the connection between that and SES, or socioeconomic status. And so a piece of there's John Henryism and there's the John Henryism hypothesis. And so what this essentially suggests is that the people who have low financial resources, they're more likely to high effort cope with challenges. And the second piece of that hypothesis is that because they have low financial resources and they are pushing themselves past their limits, but the social circumstances aren't changing, those are the folks who are actually most vulnerable to experiencing those poor physical outcomes, such as hypertension and cardiovascular disease. And so when we're having this conversation about, okay, what does John Henryism look like? Who is more apt to engage in it? I think we also have to think about what also are those other social conditions, or what is their social location in society, and the fewer resources you have, the more likely you are to engage in that, and then the more likely you are to experience those poor physical health outcomes.
Yeah.
Dr. Robinson, I wanted to ask you specifically, because you do a lot of work with Black women in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yes.
look, I'm a Black man. I'm a man first, as we understand how these things work. And I remember reading, I think the book was titled, if I butcher the title, but it was very illuminating for me. It's like, all the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. And it was a book about feminism, right? And it kind of opened my eyes to a lot of ideas and things. But the title alone was so strong in the way that it helped me think about how we have conversations about broader topics, right? So it seems like Black women get left out of a lot of these conversations. We speak about Black people, and a lot of this happened, especially when it comes to police brutality and all of these things we're talking about. Black men largely. We're talking about the impact of Black men. I remember writing an article some years ago where I talked about what was happening in Baton Rouge with Alton Sterling and all that. And it was pointed out to me that I erased I had erased Black women from the convo. So I had to write an entire article following up about how erasure of Black women is so easy to do unintentionally, but sexism, patriarchy, all these things. So why is it so important to make sure that we include Black women into these conversations? Like, how does the impact for men, those of us with the blind spots, what are we missing, and why is it so important to make sure that we have these conversations so that we don't do it?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Panama, for that recognition. And so before I get started in that, I actually want to share that we hear a lot about John Henry, but we don't hear about Polly Ann, his wife. And so And for me, this was drawn to my attention while I was going through my dissertation scholarship. And I was like, oh, like, we don't hear much about his wife, but it's like, who took up the mantle after John Henry died? His wife, Polly Ann. And so for me, that really spoke to this really challenge in terms of Black women's erasure and historical context, just in a general sense. And so, in terms of my research and how I even got started, wanted even to look at John Henryism and Black women, is that I started off doing work on the strong Black woman role or superwoman schema. And so, that was coined by Sherry Lascombe, an amazing mentor of mine. And so, that really speaks about, Black women and not wanting to show vulnerability, caring for others above oneself, and essentially what all of that does in shaping health. And so I wanted to delve a little bit deeper, and someone was like, well, why don't you look at John Henryism? So when I first saw it, I was like, well, John Henryism is just a Black man version of Superwoman schema. Totally wrong, right? They're very similar, but they do different. They represent different things conceptually, and they do different things to your health. And so, in terms of research on John Henryism and Black women, I think it's really important to bring Black women into this conversation because they also experience negative health effects. They may look different than Black men's because of those societal aspects, but they do experience adverse health outcomes from engaging in it. And so, for example, one of my recent works, I actually looked at John Henryism and how it shaped mental and physical health among African American and Caribbean Black women. And so, thinking about the role of ethnicity in this conversation as well, and just really thinking about the importance of bringing Black women's experiences into this conversation, particularly because Black women in the United States, we experience general stressors that the typical person experiences, but we also experience very distinct types of discrimination, even thinking about gendered racism, that really puts us in a position where not only are we just navigating those general things day to day, but we also have to think, well, okay, well, why did this happen? Because I was Black, I'm a woman. Like, did this happen because of my social positioning? Like, why did this happen? And so just thinking about all those challenges that we as Black women have to contend with, and how it's important to recognize what that looks like and what that does to us in terms of our mental and physical well-being. And so in that particular paper I'm mentioning, I looked at Caribbean Black women because a lot of scholarship in John Henryism has really focused on the Black American experience. But I thought personally, well, I have a lot of Black friends who are actually Caribbean, but I didn't realize that until much later, because a lot of Caribbean Black Americans and even other Black immigrants, it's this idea is if you're Black in the United States, you're automatically African American. Unfortunately, that is what society tells us. And what happens is folks experience this feeling of in-betweenness. So am I African American? Am I Caribbean? What does that look like in those particular challenges? And so in this paper, I focused on Caribbean Black women because post 1965, we've had over 4.4 million Caribbean Black immigrants come to the United States, and over 50% of them have been women. And so that's a large population of Caribbean Black women. And the Caribbean has a history and legacy of slavery as well. And so I thought to myself, particularly, I have training in sociology and social work and public health. I wanted to think of it from a sociological perspective. Well, could they have shared experiences with African American women in terms of how we're navigating high effort coping? And essentially, I looked at self-rated health. And so feelings of, like, how would you generally rate your health on a scale of 1 to 5? And I also looked at stressors. And so like chronic stress, everyday discrimination, goal striving stress, and those particular forms of stress. And essentially what I found is that among the collective group of Black women and among Caribbean Black women, John Henryism didn't directly shape their rates of self-rated health. But after I considered those various stress exposures, John Henryism was actually associated with lower odds of reporting fair or poor self-rated health among both the collective group of Black women, but also Caribbean Black women themselves. And so for me, this showed to me that though different culturally, once you get to the United States and live that experience as a Black individual, or that experience is placed upon you, that shifts how you have to navigate your day to day life in terms of racism and coping with racism in a way that you may not necessarily be accustomed to. And what does that do psychologically? What does that do physically for you? And particularly, research has actually shown that by the second generation, Black immigrants' health actually mirrors that of the destination. And so I think that's an important conversation to be had too, in terms of, well, what groups are we looking at? What groups of Black women? Well, one, are we excluding Black women? And if not, which groups of Black women are we including or not? How are their experiences shared? How are they different? And particularly in terms of John Henryism, like what does it look like for them practically, and what other ways, how essentially can we go from this idea of culturally relevant coping to healing? And I think that is something that I am transitioning to looking into in my work, because this coping thing is fine to an extent, but it's harming us at the end of the day. And so how can we, while we are working towards addressing these injustices and these structural inequalities that we did not put upon ourselves, how can we take care of ourselves as we are working to dismantle these systems? And I think that is something that I'm shifting towards in terms of Black women, because the burden shouldn't always be on us. And I think, unfortunately, that is that's been
That's a whole
the
different
historical
conversation right there.
trajectory.
That's a whole different.
Right. And so it's just, right. And so just thinking about, like, bringing Black women into the conversation, but doing it in a balanced way. So it's like, how are we, what are we seeing among this group? How did we get here? And how can we get to a healthier space?
Yeah, no, that's an important perspective, and one that I think just as people, we all need to be aware of, understanding how all of these things how they impact people differently, number one, but how they impact us all the same in the worst possible ways when these things happen. As we bring this to a close, I guess you alluded to John Henry's wife at the end of the day, and I guess I wonder how John Henry is a folklore for many people. It's a myth to some degree. He is a myth to many people. There's statues. I mean, even after reading the book and doing more research of my own, like even a representation of what John Henry looks like is probably not even accurate. It's just the Americanized version of the strong Black man who's the fascination that we have with a certain look and aesthetic about beating the system, and oddly, as an American construct, being okay with this being a representation of beating the system, when like the system that beat the man down in the first place is the one that we have a very complicated relationship with race and understanding symbology in this country. I think is kind of where I fall on that spectrum. But I guess the question is this, what do we think the real story of John Henry, like that Dr. Nelson tried to write about in his book and tried to bring to the forefront, and like what can real information and understanding as much of a true story is available about the real people that are behind these ideas, like the real John Henry, like how can information like that better help us understand and maybe do better, or maybe like what value does that bring to a conversation about John Henryism, the true story of what this man dealt with, as opposed to how we want to view him societally and symbolically for the purposes of telling a story, or the Battle of John Henry and labor and things like that. Dr. Sullivan, let's start with you.
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think John Henryism is all of us. I mean, when I look at my life, I would argue, I look at my son's life, folks around me, John Henry represents the myth of a man represents me, represents you, represents our life. The question to me is, and this is what's profound with Sherman James' work, the question is, what do we do? We know we know we're gonna face discrimination. We know we're gonna face inequalities. We know that. The question really, for me, and as I teach my 14-year-old when he deals with racism and discrimination, is what are you going to do about it, right? So you have options. The options that John Henry made, the myth of a man that we all make, is what are we willing to go through, and how are we going to go through that? And as I think about George Floyd, I think about Breonna Taylor, I think about, my life and our lives. I think about we can either quit, which are low effort copers, or we can continue to struggle. We can continue to overcome. We can continue to progress to reach our destination, whatever that is, reach our goals, whatever that is, knowing that we do have to sacrifice in order to achieve that goal. We do have to sacrifice maybe our peace at times. We have to sacrifice. We have to sacrifice not getting mad and not getting upset and not getting angry. We have to sacrifice that in order to be successful. And I think this is what Dr. Robinson is alluding to when she's talking about how do we get in the middle of that, right? How do we, in order to achieve that success, how do we also protect our sanity? How do we protect our mental space as we try to progress? And so I think in the real world of things, and this is why I really looked at this concept in politics, is like, you can't separate high effort coping just in education or just in the health field. High effort coping, any decisions that human beings make, consciously or subconsciously, you have to ask, are you going to overcome? Because nothing in life is going to be so smooth that you're just going to have to just glide to success. You have to overcome. And the last thing I want to add is, now, this concept is not just used for African Americans. What we found is that the measure is a reliable measure for Asians, Hispanics, and for Middle Eastern populations. So, this concept of overcoming, this concept of coping, how do you get to your destination, is a real challenge for people. And we started this conversation with, are these conscious effort, or is it subconscious effort that people are making? And what I'm teaching my son is that you have to consciously make this choice. You know what you're going to face, but consciously you control what you're going to do. So that's a conscious effort that you're going to either overcome, or you're going to put forth the effort, or you're going to just sit back and life just keep beating you and you're just going to quit. And so I think the myth of a man is so much the reality of folks in American society, that we need more work. We need to look at it in terms of all aspects of life.
So, I mean, I think about things from an educational context. Mm-hmm. That's just generally how I go about that. And I know in education, we don't do a really good job regulating thoughts and ideas in education, right? If you go into any school, you'll see, have a growth mindset, be grittier. And I think these kind of narratives and these kind of messages are I think they're hurtful and they're harmful, especially to certain groups of people who've always relied on that just because that's how the system is set up for those things. So I think for me, and what I think about my work in terms of John Henryism, and the story of John Henry is most of the people I know from West Virginia know the story of John Henry just because that's where it's from. But I think in terms of thinking about that connection, it's me having conversations with my students, especially my white students, about what this looks like, right? About why you hear resilience, why you hear grit, why you think those things are good, but maybe those aren't the best ways of understanding what people are going through. And it's not just Black people, because in my research I've also found that Hispanic people score as high as Black people on the John Henryism measure. So I think a lot of it has to come through education, and especially for people in as we think of dominant culture, right? Myself being included. Who am I talking to? What are the entry points to that thing? Right. So, I mean, I think of Black Thought talks about John Henry specifically in one of his songs. Right. So it's like, okay, Black Thought mentions John Henry. What is he referring to? What does that mean? And again, I think like there's different accessible points in which to do that. So I think, I mean, not to keep pulling on hip hop, I think hip hop does a really great job of kind of bridging
you're speaking my language with that
gap,
so.
Right. And there's, I mean, any number of songs, No Days Off, No Days Off, No Days Off, Hustle and Motivate, right? All those things, there's meaning to that. And I think that's an entry point into thinking about what John Henryism is, and then what the metaphor of John Henry means.
Yeah, and Dr. Robinson, same question for you, which I think you made it more clear, Dr. Torsney, like the metaphor of John Henry versus the reality of the story. I guess I could have made that more simple, but what value do we have there in understanding the metaphor versus the reality, and how we, especially in Black communities too, like engage with John Henryism and our coping strategies. I mean, we need them. We need those to survive, but at what cost?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Panama. And I'm thinking to that question, questions such as what does it mean to overcome come up for me. What does it mean to overcome in terms of, you work hard to succeed, but you have a variety of like mental and physical chronic health conditions that you will have to manage for the rest of your life. And so it's like, did you or did you not overcome? And so I think that is what it brings up for me in terms of, what does it mean to overcome? What does it mean to reach a destination? Why are we trying to overcome? Why are we trying to get to these particular destinations? Like what do we desire to get out of these things? And I think for me, in terms of the myth versus reality, I hate to say this, but I think in so many ways, the myth of John Henry, and I feel like maybe Dr. Torsney or Dr. Sullivan may have alluded to it earlier. It's just this idea of like, it's an excuse to put more on people. And so for me, I've recently begun to really think more deeper about like this idea of embodiment, in terms of like, what does it mean to engage in John Henryism, and how it disconnects you from your body. But it makes me think of, in so many ways, John Henryism is like a response to colonialism, really. You're responding to these particular systems because it's like you're stuck in the system. In terms of embodiment, it's like cutting you off from your connection between your mind and your body to keep you going and going and going and going. And so in so many ways, I feel like, and again, I don't know who created the folk hero of John Henry, but it's like creating this figure to show these folks who were previously enslaved, here, this is what you need to emulate. Here, this is what you need to do in terms of embodying American values. And in Dr. James's, some of his earlier work, I actually found an interesting paragraph where he essentially posited that John Henryism was developed, by previously enslaved Black folks to mirror those American values of hard work and determination and a drive to succeed, in order to be viewed as credible. And I'm in a different position. I'm no longer in this enslaved position. How can we set ourselves up as a people to be viewed as worthy, essentially, to navigate this American society? And so when I found that, I was like, aha, like so for me, when you ask me that question in terms of the myth and the reality, I think in so many ways the myth serves to lead to the reality in terms of how folks are conditioned, whether it be from external conditions and or like intergenerational socialization. This is what we do to counter these systems that have been killing us, for lack of better words. So it's like this is what we have to do to navigate. But I think for me and my work, I'm transitioning to recognizing the utility of coping mechanisms such as John Henryism, but also recognizing this is not enough. This is not enough. This is actually harming us. What can we do in terms of being creative in order to, like, what other healthier forms of coping can we engage in? And I think for me, that's why I'm focusing on mindfulness research now. It's a more individual level thing, but again, we have to keep our sanity and our well-being while the powers that be and the systems that be are doing what they do, because we have to, we are worthy of more, and we have to believe that internally, as we are navigating things that are, so many things that are out of our control. And in so many ways, I feel like John Henryism helps us to feel in control. But what happens when that sense of control harms your health?
That's a great place to end this conversation, on a question that I don't think anybody has the answer to. That I suppose that most of us are trying to figure out, probably when it's too late. I would like to thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation on John Henryism, Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Torsney, Dr. Robinson. I would encourage, people who are listening to this conversation to do more research into John Henryism itself and understanding. I find it fascinating. I kept saying earlier, it just feels like the Black experience, and that's how it does feel to me. But I also think it's a worthy thing to look into, especially coping mechanisms and the psychology of it all and how it intersects so many facets of just life in general. And also for historical context on what we're even talking about, make sure you check out the book by Dr. Scott Reynolds Nelson, Still Drivin Man, John Henry, The Untold Story of an American Legend, which I had the honor of narrating, which was an experience for me, because I do think that historical context is important. I do think understanding how we get to these places to begin with helps understand the narratives that are built. And I think what Dr. Robinson said is very important about kind of the response, John Henryism as a response to colonialism. Like it really is. Like, that's how I view it. It just, what are you supposed to do when the whole system is built to hold you down? Which I love how Dr. Torsney keeps bringing hip hop into, because it seems like so much of hip hop is a direct response to that response of being held down, right? I'm not going to quote lyrics here because they're inappropriate, but Kanye has many lyrics that speak directly to the idea of, hey, what are you doing this for? It doesn't change the perception to begin with, right? So thank you for everybody for listening. Truly an insightful conversation. I really appreciate our guests. Thank you all for being here. Until next time, Panama Jackson.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Panama.
Thank you all for this very in-depth and very insightful conversation. Special thanks to the team at Marginal Media Works who produced the audiobook, Sanjay Sharma, Milan Chakraborty, Brian Aguilar, and Sterling Shore. And make sure you check out the audiobook for Still Drivin Man, John Henry, The Untold Story of an American Legend, which is available wherever you listen to audiobooks, Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Audible, all those places.